Mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir. Je suis très heureuse de me joindre à vous de manière virtuelle pour cette soirée citoyenne. J'aimerais premièrement féliciter les organisateurs du sommet et tous les participants. Nous assistons depuis le début de cet événement à un partage d'idées et d'expériences autour de la justice fiscale qui me ravit littéralement. Bravo et merci aux professionnels et aux chercheurs émérites en fiscalité. Et bravo et merci au grand public qui participe en grand nombre. Ce sommet me donne confiance en nos forces actuelles qui sont garantes de l'avenir. Maintenant, sachez que les sujets qui seront abordés ce soir sont au cœur de mon mandat en tant que ministre du Revenu national. Comment améliorer et maintenir l'éthique fiscale par des gestes concrets? Ou encore, comment s'assurer que notre régime fiscal demeure équitable pour tous? Ce sont des questions qui figurent au premier plan de mon mandat depuis 2015. L'Agence du revenu du Canada et moi-même travaillons sans relâche pour procurer aux Canadiens, aux particuliers et aux entreprises une prestation de services satisfaisante. Nous le faisons en plaçant les gens d'abord, qui est l'élément clé de notre nouveau modèle de service et dont les principes essentiels sont les suivants. Nous faisons des gens notre priorité, nous leur offrons notre appui, nous formons une équipe à leur service, nous innovons et finalement, et non le moindre, nous sommes justes. Nous avons tous à cœur de maintenir bien haut l'équité et l'intégrité de notre système fiscal canadien. J'ajouterai à cela que nous accomplissons notre mission en mettant à contribution la fine pointe de la technologie. À ce propos, j'invite tous les gens à utiliser les fonctions de clavardage qui sont mises à votre disposition pour exprimer votre point de vue au cours de cette soirée citoyenne. Nous réalisons tous, je crois, qu'un sommet entièrement virtuel comme celui-ci aurait été impossible il y a quelques années à peine. Alors, sans plus tarder, levons nos verres tous ensemble à l'équité en matière fiscale. Fort heureusement, nos verres n'ont rien de virtuel. Je cède maintenant la parole à M. Philippe Van Parijs, philosophe, professeur de l'Université catholique de Louvain de Belgique et titulaire de la Chaire Hoover d'éthique économique et sociale. Je vous remercie à tous et bonne soirée.
Share a few thoughts with you on the subject of this conference. I shall try very briefly to address two big problems. The first, what is a just tax system? And the second one, what can make taxpayers willingly comply with such a tax system? To address the first question, there is one common but profoundly wrong way of framing that question. Namely the following: I earn this money, and under what conditions is it fair for the state to take part of it from me? The point of departure should rather be the realization that the bulk of my income is the product of factors for which I don't have the slightest merit. Why? What are these factors? Favorable natural conditions, past technical progress and capital accumulation, all aspects of the economic, social, and political organization of our societies. In addition to all that, all sorts of contingencies in the course of my own personal life. And the question then becomes, how should this huge gift for which I did nothing, which is the basis of most of my income, how should this huge gift be fairly distributed between the members of our society? This requires then this leads to two sub-questions. One, what is our society? Is it Quebec? Is it Canada? Is it America? Is it the whole world? And two, what should be the criterion of distribution? Should we distribute this huge gift according to some notion of virtue, Should we try to maximize the total of what is being produced in society? Should we try to equalize as much as we can? My answer to the first question is that fundamentally social justice today must be global justice, but we won't get there in one go, so we must also think about justice at the national level. And my answer to the second question was the criterion is not maximize growth, maximize the total, it's not minimize inequalities, it is the sustainable maximum. Maximize what can be given in a sustainable way to those with least possibilities, with least opportunities, with least real freedom. This requires doing many things, universal basic education, healthcare, quality public spaces, a universal basic income, all this funded by taxation at the highest feasible level that yield taxation that maximize the revenues in a sustainable way. The concern for sustainability forces us, of course, to take incentives into account. Taxation must be such that people will work, train, invest, save in such a way that what can be given to the worst off is maximized. It must therefore be economically sustainable, something like the top of the Laffer curve in the economic jargon, but it must also be economically sustainable, and that means that it must also try to internalize externalities, that is, try to through taxation to orient consumption and production in a way that protects the future generations. That's the first question. Let me then turn to the second one. What can make taxpayers willingly comply with such a tax system? I suggest there are 4 strategies that are complementary. The first one is what you could call a gestalt switch, a change in perception. The tax we pay is not part of the fruit of our labor that the government is trying to snatch from me. No, taxation is a fee that I pay for the use of these amazing opportunities from which I benefit. And it is this fee is then used in order to secure the highest level of possibilities to those with least of them. And I'll still be left, because of the incentives to which I just referred, I'll still be left with a far bigger share of this gift, of this undeserved gift, than the worst off in my society. So, first strategy, there is this change in perception of what taxation is. Secondly, the type of taxation we use is certainly relevant to expose the illusion of the misleading way of presenting taxation as theft by the state. For example, if we use income taxation, taxation at source, pay as you go, is certainly better than ex post taxation. Also, a consumption tax, whether a VAT or any form of green tax, does probably better also in this respect than income taxes or payroll taxes. And thirdly, I must say I'm intrigued and interested by the idea of a micro tax on all electronic transfers. It's an idea that has been tried and that has been defended in many countries that more or less recently. It is currently about to be submitted to a national referendum in Switzerland. It's the idea that you tax this huge tax base, which is a huge multiple of GDP, and so the sum of all electronic transfers, you tax it as a very low rate. Of course, there is a high tax elasticity, but this would be a sort of fairly smooth, soft way of taxing all income. Thirdly, it's very important that people should feel that if someone else is in the same situation as them in relevant respects, that these people should be treated by the tax system in a similar way. That means that we must minimize cheating. I'm also intrigued and interested by what could be called very roughly the Scandinavian system, which enables every citizen to know the tax bill of every other citizen. As a result of this sort of practice, you have more tax compliance for two reasons. One is that you feel more watched and therefore you'll comply better for fear of a sanction, but also because the second reason for higher compliance is that you know that other people will also comply because they are similarly feeling watched by, potentially by everyone. So first thing, in order to treat people and to make them feel that they are treated in the same way, we must repress cheating. But also we must repress tax evasion, including legal tax evasion in all sorts of ways, the more favorable treatment of those incomes, those assets that are better protected because they are internationally more mobile. And therefore international cooperation in order to keep tax competition under threat, in order also to destroy tax havens is extremely important, even if we think of social justice as national justice rather than as global justice. And finally, fourth strategy, we must create trust, legitimate trust in the way in which taxes, the product of taxation, is being yielded. And the way of creating this trust is not by increasing the part of taxation that is earmarked for where people can decide what it's going to be used for, but rather by being able to count on elected officials and on civil servants that are both competent and have the integrity that is required to make a good use of those resources. And that's a matter of recruitment, a matter of transparency, a matter also of placing these various competences at the right level of centralization or decentralization. Thank you for having accompanied me, joined me in this quick gallop through a number of answers to the two big questions I asked at the start. I hope this provides you with some thought for, some food for thought, and also I think for disagreement in the course of the panel, which is now going to follow. Thank you very much for your attention.
Alors, merci beaucoup à Monsieur Parijs, merci à Madame Lebouthillier. Welcome to everyone. My name is Tammy Emma-Pépin, so I'll be with you for the evening. And tonight is all about tax responsibility for all. It's about fairness, it's about ethics, it's about inclusivity, and more specifically, how tax policy and tax administration can support these values. So we've asked three proactive and inspiring experts in this field to share their personal expertise and experience in working to support a tax-responsible society. Just a few words in French. Une société fiscalement responsable, c'est quoi? C'est une société dans laquelle les contribuables se sentent traités équitablement à travers les règles et leur administration. So tonight's guests have been involved in thinking about a variety of issues that make a tax system fairer, such as who pays taxes, how transparent the process is, gender bias, and other elements such as considering the relations between tax authorities and taxpayers. So they're each going to take 10 minutes this evening to present their insights, to present their views on this topic. So I'll introduce them to you and then we'll begin the conversation. So first of all, we'll be joined today by Nina Olsen. Madame Olsen is the Executive Director of the Center for Taxpayer Right. She is a former United States taxpayer advocate and former head of the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate, an independent organization within the Internal Revenue Service, dedicated to assisting taxpayers to resolve their problems with the IRS and to make administrative and legislative recommendations to mitigate those problems systematically. Before that, Nina founded and directed the Community Tax Law Project, the first independent low-income taxpayer clinic in the U.S. She will be joined also by Mr. Richard Murphy. Mr. Murphy is a chartered accountant and an economist. He's been described by The Guardian as an anti-poverty militant and a tax expert. Mr. Murphy is also the founder of the Tax Justice Network and director of the Tax Research LLP, a firm that does work on taxation policies, advocacy, and research for humanitarian agencies, trade unions, NPOs, and other organizations in the UK and elsewhere. And Mr. Murphy is also the instigator of several new issues in the debates on tax policy. Specifically, he created the entirely new concept of accounting statements by country, which is now being studied for potential implementation in the European Union, the OECD, the International Accounting Standards Board, and others. And finally, we will also hear from Madame Assa Gunnarsson. Madame Assa is the professor of tax law and jurisprudence at Umeå University in Sweden. We're happy to have her with us this evening. Her thesis on tax equity was published in 1995 and became a part of the Nordic tax law doctrine. She is the founder of the generously granted network Feminist Studies on Taxation and Budgeting, FemTax, and the activities and publications initiated by FemTax have been a part of the evolving interest on the structural impact that tax laws have on gender equality. From 2015 to 2019, Assa Gunnarsson coordinated a Horizon 2020 project titled Revisioning the Fiscal EU Fair, Sustainable, and Coordinated Tax and Social Policies. The project had an impressive dissemination output and a high impact among European stakeholders. She has written extensively on tax policy and the law, tax fairness, the tax benefit interface, gender equality and taxation, social citizenship, and gender equality law. So those are our introductions. So maybe we'll start with Nina, who joins us this evening, and maybe opening the debate with, we're talking about ethics and inclusivity. So perhaps what does that mean to you?
Well, let me first say thank you for letting me be here. And I also have to apologize in advance. I have to leave at 6:30 exactly. And so for that reason, I'm going to try to limit my remarks to 5 minutes, also out of courtesy for my fellow speakers, where it is very early in the morning for them, and I want to hear them. So I'm just going to say, in terms of ethics and inclusivity, first inclusivity, and referencing the previous presentation, I start from the point of view that, my life's work has been about the individual taxpayer's relationship with the tax agency and by extension with their government. And I really think about rights and responsibilities and the government's legitimate use of power in its taxing authority and its ability to gain the trust of taxpayers so it doesn't have to use coercive power and therefore lose the trust of its taxpayers. And so everything that I think about stems from there. And in some ways, ethics builds into that, and certainly the rights and responsibilities of taxpayers to their government, but also the responsibilities of government to their taxpayers. But my starting point for that is, and I am really a pragmatist in the sense that I have spent my life dealing with taxpayers on a one-to-one basis. And as the National Taxpayer Advocate of the IRS, my office handled, in the 18 years that I was the National Taxpayer Advocate, handled over 4 million taxpayer cases where taxpayers were having significant problems with the IRS. And now at the Center for Taxpayer Rights, I'm very much engaged in litigation on behalf of taxpayers, impact litigation, class action against the government in the administration of some of the economic programs that they are doing in the United States as part of this COVID recovery litigation. But my understanding of taxpayers, at least in the United States, is that they really do view taxes as a taking of their property. And I take my taxpayers as I find them. And so if that's their starting point, then we need to do something about that. We need to explain to them. And I think it will be hard, at least in the United States, to convince them that it is not their property that we are taking from them, but to convince them that there is a reason to give up your hard-earned property for the public good. And that is what taxes are all about. And if you're able to frame it in that way, then maybe you can start to have a conversation that might over time expand to a conversation about how did you get this property in the first place. But again, I take my taxpayers as I find them, and I have found them very individualistic and very much protective of their property. And so to close sort of that discussion, like what is it that taxpayers need then in order to be able to give up what they perceive as their property, is a sense that they are going to be treated right in this process of taking their property for the public good. And so where others will talk about distributive justice and other forms of justice, where I have really focused on is procedural justice. How are taxpayers treated? And that is where taxpayer charters, taxpayer bills of rights, and remedies and protections that are part of that, you know, that you don't just have an abstract right, you have a way of enforcing that right. That is where that becomes extraordinarily important. And I will close with just something that I think that the world is going to have to deal with as we're, you know, as we are in this post-COVID environment, and I don't see many countries doing a very good job of this, is, you know, you have a great job of assessing tax, determining how much people should pay under your laws. But when you come to the fact that of the collection of tax, you know, for many people in the post-COVID economy, they will not be able to pay. And what are your mechanisms as a government for dealing with the specific facts and circumstances of the taxpayer in a fair and balanced way so that other taxpayers who did happen to pay entirely can understand that maybe this taxpayer isn't going to pay the full balance due because they cannot. And is that, how do you do that fairly to other taxpayers? And I'll close there just with those opening thoughts.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps just a question, because I know you have to go soon, Nina, but have you seen that the crisis has, how has it impacted Americans or perhaps the behavior of tax administrations? Have you noticed anything there?
Well, you know, the IRS has shoveled out to 160 million taxpayers economic impact payments, starting within 3 weeks of the law in March passing. I mean, it's been an incredible feat. But we have also seen decisions being made that impact greatly the fairness of some of the policy calls. For example, the IRS, you know, or Treasury deciding that they were not going to pay those funds to persons who were incarcerated or were on a list of incarcerated people, but may not be incarcerated today. Mm-hmm. And, you know, this is part of the class action that is going forward on some of these things. So you see some challenges there. And I think we're only getting a grasp on how you deal with the economic fallout going forward. The government was very wise in saying, the tax administration was very wise in saying very early on they were putting a moratorium on audits and collection activities, you know, until July 15th. But, you know, the COVID didn't go away in July 15th. It's still around, and people are having even more economic harm at that point. And so it's going to be very important to see what happens going forward.
Mm-hmm. And I think another interesting point that you made, at least from a Canadian perspective, is you talked about how do you actually convince individuals and taxpayers that there's a reason to pay their taxes for the public good. Is there any way that you think this kind of education or this type of thinking can perhaps shift? What can be done?
Well, I think every country is different. You know, the culture of every country is different. And I can only speak for the United States, which is that every time as a tax administrator where we've talked about doing a public campaign to sort of say, this is what your taxes buy, you know, this is what your taxes pay for. That has been roundly classified as propaganda and you're not allowed to do that. And that is very bizarre to me. And so part of what the Center for Taxpayer Rights wants to work on is actually a public information campaign that would educate taxpayers about what is the point of taxes. And I've also advocated that taxpayers be given a receipt, which actually shows precisely what their taxes go for. And I've even gone further than that to say we should have, an ability for taxpayers when they file their taxes to say, here's my vote, here's the pie chart, here's how I want my taxes to be divided up. Now, that's not going to determine where the taxes are, but it is going to show what people think and where their values are. And it will also show, it's sort of like a survey, it will also show how people feel. And some people will say, we don't want to fund the military at all. Others will say, we want to fund it entirely. Some people will say, I want it to go to the arts. I want it to go to, poverty eradication. And maybe you'll see overall, that there's a pattern that it balances out somehow. I don't know, but we've never done that. And I think that that would be at least an interesting tool to engage taxpayers in thinking about taxation being something above and beyond just money being taken away from them. There is a purpose for it. And, let's ask them. I'm not saying it's binding. Definitely not. That's the role of the legislators. But it would inform and it would educate.
Thank you so much, Nina, for sharing your insights and your expertise with us. Thank you so much. I want to move on to maybe Mr. Murphy. Richard, thank you for being with us. I saw you shaking your head there. Do you want to share your thoughts with us?
Well, I might come back on what Nina said, but I want to talk first of all around the theme of obviously what I've been invited to talk about.
Yes.
And I'm wearing 3 hats, I suspect, here, but I'm going to choose one in particular. I mean, I'm a tax practitioner, and I have been for 40 years. I've been a tax campaigner for 20 years, and I've been a professor of political economy and accounting for 5 years. But I'm actually really talking tonight from the perspective of the tax professional. And it's from that perspective I thought the choice of topic was really interesting. And that's because I think there's a really strong ethical duty at this moment for those engaged in the tax world to truly understand the interaction between tax and the way that governments around the world are now going to address the coronavirus crisis. Now, I'm only too well aware that many people think that this relationship between tax and government is a very simple one, and they believe, tax professionals and tax campaigners alike, I should add, that tax funds government spending. However, in very many countries, the simple fact is that this is not true, and actually, I would now argue that in economic theory it's not true either. Most countries now fund government expenditure through a combination of tax and borrowing. And of course, in very many developed countries, there is a third component to this equation now, which is that governments can use either quantitative easing or direct monetary funding as a mechanism to also fund the way in which they meet their promises to the societies that they govern. So, for example, and to refer to the UK, which is where I'm speaking from, this year there will be a record government deficit of £350 billion. But not a single penny of that so far this year, and 200 billion has so far been incurred as a deficit, has been funded in any way, shape or form by the taxpayer. That deficit has been entirely paid for by quantitative easing. So there's been no demand on the money markets either. And all the discussion that we're having about, will the markets pay for this? Will taxpayers stand this burden? Is completely irrelevant because the government has actually funded this itself. And it has the capacity to do so without creating inflation because there is less than full employment, and that's going to get very much worse. So the expenditure is not funded by tax. So in that case, the focus of so much of our debate within tax on the ability of tax to fund expenditure is actually fairly inappropriate. And my plea tonight is that we as tax professionals should not presume that this is the role of tax. Instead, I would ask that we understand that tax is actually a part, as far as a government is concerned, and in this context I'm a macroeconomist, as far as governments are concerned, tax is a function of fiscal and social policy as well. Our job then, as tax professionals, is to understand this greater role of tax at this time, when government is highly likely over the next few years to play a bigger role in our lives than it has for a very long time. And this will challenge some very familiar assumptions. For example, the commonplace belief that tax should be raised to pay for the coronavirus crisis might, at this time, very well be wrong. I have literally seen one of the professional accounting institutes in the United Kingdom argue this tonight, and I will say that they have straightforwardly made a mistake. In my role as a professional political economist, I focus very heavily, as I said, on macroeconomics. That is the funding of the state as a whole. And in that context, raising tax right now would be a straightforward mistake for the vast majority of countries. And that's because raising tax reduces demand, and reducing demand reduces the income available to companies, and that in direct turn reduces the amount that they have available to spend on employees, and that will therefore contribute directly to unemployment, which is the biggest crisis that we're all going to face over the time to come. Health apart, perhaps. So we have a duty, I suggest, to understand that and to appreciate that at this moment, a government might want to borrow instead of tax, and that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But it's also important at this moment to appreciate that at the level of government, when it thinks about tax, whether that's in terms of dollars, pounds, euros, yens, or whatever, those pounds and euros and so on are not all equal. It's very important to understand that tax paid has a very different economic function depending upon who pays it. So, for example, and to refer again to this problem of the shortage of demand that's going to create unemployment, taxing the wealthy more at this moment has very little impact on demand. That is because any increase in tax on the wealthy can be paid out of their savings, which by definition the wealthy have. In contrast, giving a tax cut to the poorest in our societies at present increases what they can spend, and so is likely to be profoundly beneficial as a mechanism to increase demand, and so to tackle unemployment, and so to help us all through the coronavirus crisis. There is then at this moment a very good reason for pure economics why governments around the world should want to tax the rich more while cutting tax rates on those with the lowest pay, while seeking overall to increase their tax yield by nothing at all, which is what economically I would suggest they should be doing. And that's because this will reallocate income from those who save to those who spend, and that will increase demand. Now, of course, I'm aware, very well aware, that there are very many tax practitioners who are none too happy about seeing any increase in taxes on wealth. But we're talking ethics tonight, and I'll suggest to you that those reservations should be put aside right now for the common good. And I'll also say that of those who promote tax avoidance, let alone those, and I know they exist, who turn a blind eye to tax evasion. That's because I know that right now in the UK, for example, and in many other countries, there are hundreds of thousands of businesses, and I mean that in the UK context, who are profoundly vulnerable to failure right now in a way that could be immensely costly to our chances of economic recovery from this crisis over the years to come. Those businesses are already facing enormous risk of failure. And for the many honest businesses that exist, to have their chances of survival threatened by those who avoid or even evade their tax liabilities, giving those cheats, therefore, an unfair tax advantage, just increase that risk, while leaving society with a chance that the survivors in the corporate world might be those who are willing to turn the greatest blind eye to the contribution that they should be making to society. My plea then is to tax practitioners to also understand this. And I can be honest and say few practitioners Sorry, I'll start that again. If I am honest, I will say that few professions are as selfish as ours. We have virtually defined our professional ethics around an obligation to increase the personal wealth of our clients, irrespective of the cost to society of them doing so. I readily admit that I've always been unhappy about that view, but I know that a substantial number of practitioners are very happy with it. Well, if we are again referring to ethics, then I suggest that this is the time for that ethic to change as well. The ethical challenge to the profession at this moment is then, I would suggest, threefold. In the first instance, it really is time we understand the real role of tax within the macroeconomy of our countries, of which we are a part, so that we can truly understand the way in which tax systems might have to adapt to the crisis we face, so that the most vulnerable in particular in our societies can be supported. I suggest that every professional institute of tax anywhere in the world should now be providing teaching on this issue, and that it should be part of every tax professional's syllabus of education. Secondly, now is the time for us to appreciate that we have to explain to our clients that some previously accepted behaviours cannot be tolerated if we as communities at large are to survive this crisis, which is, of course, the only way we can do so. In that case, we might also have a duty to explain to our clients why, for the time being, higher rates of tax may be appropriate in their cases, even if others are benefiting from tax cuts. And third, we have a professional duty to recognise that tax cheating destroys fair markets, undermines businesses, crushes honest employment, and denies people the choices that they expect within the mixed economies in which we all live. If ever there was a time to stand up to tax cheating, this is it. The very survival of the markets on which I suspect many of us are pinning our hopes for an economic recovery completely depend upon the end of that tax cheating. In summary, this is the moment when tax ethics have ceased to be personal. Tax ethics are now about our role as tax practitioners, helping to preserve our societies in the face of a challenge that none of us have ever expected, and which will, I regret to say, be much bigger than many of us are as yet willing to believe. This is the moment for tax ethics to come to the fore. They have never been so important.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Richard, for that pledge, if I may say. Thank you so much for sharing your ideas with us. We are going to move on to Asa, and then we'll come back and we'll continue the conversation and talk about these ideas. So, Madame Asa Gunnarsson, la parole est à vous.
Merci. I'm mainly going to talk about gender, the relation between gender equality and taxation. But of course, I have to start in the present crisis that we are living through. The sad story about the pandemic is that it really the outbreak was coinciding with the 25th anniversary of the Beijing platform for action, and for the UN 2020 was intended to be a groundbreaking year for gender equality initiatives, but instead UN today, through its General Secretary, claims that the ongoing spread of the pandemic is risking the limited gains regarding gender equality made in the past. So that's a very a sad situation. But taking that into consideration, one have also to understand that I just have got help from my senior vet. But just before the pandemic, national tax laws worked against tax laws were not helping out when it came to gender equality. It was really working against many of those reforms or the economic incentives that it was needed for improving or empowering women's economic rights. We have and there's always been an ignorance from tax policy makers or tax legislators to kind of consider the gender equality obligations that almost all countries are committed to, either or both from national legislation, from constitutions, and particularly from the CEDAW Convention, and that also all countries almost in the world are monitored by under the Baying platform. That kind of ignorance has kind of kept women in a prison, and most of the tax reform that we've seen being promoted in the last 4 decades, starting almost with the Laffer curve that we heard about initially on this conference, doesn't consider at all the socio-economic realities among women. It's just taking one example that a lot of women have been working themselves up from poverty, but the pandemic situation, let's say for a cleaning woman in Lima that has lost her position as a cleaner, that is not asked for from the rich household in Lima. She lost all her income. She has a house. She has she can have food on the table. She can have her children at school. But I mean, this pandemic situation will bring her back down under the poverty line again. And this will be the situation for a lot of women, and because their economic situation was already very vulnerable long before the pandemic. So the ignorance, but there has been a kind of insight that the tax system that we promoted during these last 4 years under the optimal tax theory don't really improve income inequalities in societies. It has been, and that will be kind of be counterproductive to the idea of taxing for economic growth. And it's from this concept we have the powerful organizations like the IMF and the OECD, the European Commission, have started to discuss the concept of inclusive growth. It came before the pandemic, and they were based on lessons learned from the financial economic crisis earlier. Hopefully there is an open window here where there is a possibility to learn, but there is from the gender equality perspective, there is very little insights on how to proceed or how to kind of go into the tax system and find the problems and solve them. So what I want to address here is that I'm kind of skeptical to this kind of new idea about inclusiveness in taxation and inclusive economic growth, because there is, if you look on the reforms, I mean, there were really a pile of tax reforms that were needed in order to empower women in general in the world, in the European, in Europe, in high-income countries around Europe or in the North America, but there was no sign of incentivizing those kind of reform. One of those reforms, or one package of reforms that it is really needed to empower women, is that to abolish all joint tax instruments in the personal income tax schemes. There are best practices. If you look on the Nordic countries, for example, and Sweden in particular, we have shown the way what kind of improvement what kind of economic improvement you can reach if introducing independent personal income tax. But I mean, that, for example, has been on the agenda in the European Union for many years now, but very little is happening, and I don't see that the IMF are promoting that type of reforms in their kind of structural adjustment programs around the world. But that is really a basic reform that is needed to kind of get the secondary earner women out of their economic traps. So I hope that this pandemic kind of bring in an idea of inclusiveness that really benefit and resource women around the world, and also consider the different conditions women are living under in high income countries, or the middle or the low income countries. So that is what I want to address this evening at your conference. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Asa. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. And maybe I can pick up here and ask a question. I know that, Richard, so you said now is a time for great ethical duty. And that really stuck with me that you said that. And I'm wondering if you can expand on that and what that means to you at a very introspective level, you know, for the individual. What does it mean to have ethics? What is this duty? How do you feel it? And what does it mean to you?
Oh, what is ethics at a very personal level? Look, I don't know any wisdom tradition around the world, by which I will include religions and literally wisdom traditions, that don't ultimately place their emphasis in ethics on one simple maxim, and that is that, in Christianity is expressed as love your neighbor as yourself, but you will find the same idea in almost every major religion. And when you come down to ethics, it is this concern for the other that matters. It is how we identify ethical conduct. It is putting the other as being at least your equal in this process, not your superior necessarily, not your subordinate, but at least your equal. And I feel that this idea has been absent from a great deal of tax ethics. As I have said in my opening comments, we have been a selfish profession when it comes to tax. Our assumption has been that we may maximize our income by minimizing our tax payment, irrespective of the consequence to others. Now, I would disagree with Nina, and I shook my head during the course of her presentation with regard to the point I made again in my presentation: does tax fund government spending? And my argument is no, it doesn't. And therefore there is no direct relationship between any dollar paid and, for example, the spend made on healthcare, because the simple fact is that that dollar on healthcare may come from another source. And that is now a fact of life. That's why I don't think that relationship exists. But is there ultimately, and in the long run, a point where taxes and revenues may coincide? Well, yes, because if our goal is to have a fair society where we have something close to or even full employment, which is my personal goal in economic policy, because I believe that is a way for delivery of justice. And I mean full employment for those who want it, not those who are coerced into it. So there would have to be social safety nets as well. But in that context, then we have to look at tax as an instrument which is important to balancing this equation, and that the integrity and honesty of the taxpayer is fundamental to delivering that process of tax and fiscal and economic policy, which is now going to pull us out of the mess that we're in. And we are dependent on government more than we've ever been at this moment to achieve that. I'm not knocking the private sector, let's be clear. I've spent most of my life working in the private sector. I've been a director of many companies. I am still a director of private sector companies. So this is not a significant left of centre comment. It's just that, in a mixed economy, and that's what we all live in, where government and private sector have to interact. Right now, that interaction is definitely swinging towards government, and it does require us to understand that this ethos of the tax professional, which is I simply maximise the wealth of my client, is at this moment, frankly, unacceptable, because that client is like anybody else, as a person, vulnerable to coronavirus, and they have to play their part in it as much as anyone else, therefore. And that is the basis for this thinking, in my opinion.
Nina, would you like to respond to Richard's comments?
I'm not an economist. I mean, I'm not going to argue with him. My goal is to educate taxpayers about their role in society and what role taxes play in society. And I'm, again, very pragmatic and try to think about how to communicate with taxpayers at their level. And, that's where that proposal came from. And I think, it'd be very difficult to explain to most taxpayers just what Richard just explained. And I would have to go away and think about how to modify my proposal to accommodate that. But I'm not disagreeing with him. Mm-hmm. Again, I really think that it is very important in the conversations about how you go forward with taxation in any tax system is that you have to have a conversation about the rights of taxpayers and their relationship with the government and how their rights are protected. And you also have to talk about their responsibilities hand in hand. I personally am of the belief that rights, it's not a quid pro quo, that you have rights regardless of whether you've met all your responsibilities. There may be instances where those rights are curtailed because of the egregiousness of your actions, but you still have some basic rights in that system. And part of that's because governments make mistakes. And they often make really bad mistakes with respect to individual taxpayers. And that gets magnified, and it gets magnified in people's consciousness. And then that increases non-compliance. So, those are the things that I think about. I'm very taken by Ace's comments about abolishing all joint instruments. In the United States, there is joint and several liability if you file a married filing joint return, which gets you certain different tax rates as a taxable unit. And that leads to, well, what if your spouse lied, hid income? You're now jointly and severally liable for this line that you had no knowledge about. What if you were a victim of domestic violence and you could not argue with your spouse without provoking physical threat and harm to yourself? The United States tax system has developed, there's a whole code section and a whole unit in the IRS that deals with something that we call innocent spouse relief, but is actually relief from joint and several liability. So you've created a provision in the law that now you have to have a whole infrastructure to provide relief from. And every time you get those, and so yes, you've got you've got remedies there, but what you've done is you've created a structure that creates complexity, that creates a problem that then you have to solve. And wouldn't it be better to go back and rethink that? And try to eliminate that problem from arising in the first place. So there are things like that. So I was very struck by what Asa said in that regard.
And just before you go, Nina, I know that you're all in different countries right now. So I'm curious to know from where you're standing, are you seeing more or less pressure in your countries for corporations to pay their share of taxes? Are you seeing a shift there?
Oh, I think this is a very complex time, and we'll just wait for the outcome of the election before I answer that.
All right. Well, good luck with that. I know you have to leave us, so we'll continue the conversation.
I'm for leaving because I really would love to hear the rest of everybody's discussion, and please forgive me. I'm so sorry.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Richard? Perfect. Maybe Richard or Asa, do you see a shift? Do you see more or less pressure with the crisis for corporations or perhaps big tech to pay their fair share?
No, I think that the maybe this, I call it the neoliberal tax policy paradigm that has been dominated for 40 years now. Now I think it's been very, for being a Swedish welfare state, the social democratic model, we are have kind of accepted the paradigm that lower taxes on corporates will promote growth, and the same goes for capital. We have very low taxes on capital income, particularly and we have created we have and I think so it become a really liberal view on corporates and capital income in Sweden, and we have it's going to demand a quite comprehensive tax law reform to solve those, to kind of change the system. No, so that's not up on the agenda yet, no.
How about you, Richard?
Well, there's been some big stories today, for example, on Amazon and its tax affairs. I've been on the radio, I've been interviewed by national newspapers, because it is clear that Amazon is going to fall outside our new digital services tax, which the UK is introducing to supposedly challenge the activities of multinational, often US-owned corporations that are widely understood to not be paying the right amount of tax in the UK. And I would argue that on the basis of a simple country-by-country reporting analysis and apportionment using a unitary taxation base, and I'm biased about country-by-country reporting, of course, because I sort of thought the thing up a long time ago. But I would argue on that basis that, well, that's right. Amazon is not paying the right amount of tax in the UK, and its tax rate, its profit margin in the UK looks to be about 20% of the profit margin that it makes worldwide, and it's hard to explain why that might be true. So there is a lot of anger in the UK where many of these tax stories, remember, started about Amazon, Google, Starbucks, and so on. I was involved in all of them at one time. Those stories started here, and that anger is very real still, that corporations aren't paying. But there is nonetheless a very real sense that the government is quite willing to ride out that anger. We have a corporation tax rate which is only 19% less than our basic rate of income tax. And illogical as that is, that remains the case. The government cancelled a further corporation tax cut earlier this year, saying we couldn't afford it. But they have shown no indication of desiring an increase in corporation tax, and I don't see that happening yet. even with regard to large companies who could probably withstand that on the differential basis that I previously explained, there might be a reason for cutting the tax rate for smaller companies and increasing it for larger companies, because larger companies have ready access to capital, which small companies don't at present, and their cash flows are under immense pressure. But we're not seeing that reaction. So the pressure from the consumer, the angry consumer market on the government is there, and the commentary is certainly happening, but the government is ignoring it.
Okay, I would like to ask you, maybe we've outlined quite a few problems. Yesterday, even here at the summit, we talked about a potential Canadian tax reform. You know, some of the speakers mentioning like challenging and looking into the principles on which the act was actually developed and looking at it from a more holistic point of view. I'm curious to know, Asa, I know that you're very passionate, of course, about gender equality. What are some of the solutions, or what are the things that you would like to see as we re-emerge out of this crisis? What are the things that you think can be applied directly to make sure that women's rights and the things that we've gained over the last decades and generations don't, you know, slip back?
Yeah, I mean, there are the message is, of course, that we have to kind of get a grip over the secrecy economy and the whole problem with tax havens, and of course, sometimes you hope that some of the international projects regarding the multinationals should be, I mean, that the collaboration between states could kind of challenge the multinationals and how they kind of control the tax system. But in the European Union project, we really looked into the common corporate tax base in Europe, which has been on the table for the whole system of the internal market, and I'm very cynical or maybe very pessimistic concerning that project, I must say, and with Britain leaving the European Union and the whole issue with there is no kind of answer idea on how to kind of separate the corporate, the multinational corporates in the European Union, the European corporates. That's a kind of a big challenge. So I don't see really any powerful. I mean, the UN is not. I don't believe in the UN. I don't believe in the European Union. I don't see where we have the kind of power. Where have the central power that could kind of, maybe the pandemic will kind of bring in some. You talk about ethics around the professionals. Maybe we also can see, instead of what I'm afraid of, that is going to create social movements. It's going to create panic in the world, and people are going to start to move, and taxes has been one of the most have been the trigger for many civil wars and very much violence in the world in history. So this could be a solution, if not we can use the world can come together. Mm-hmm. I don't see the power. Where is the base for that? I can't see it.
Well, perhaps it's in the network. Perhaps it's in the. I like to believe that there are solutions and that we're going to have to find them. So perhaps it's in the network, and it's in those ethics, and it's, you know, good people coming together and believing in common shared human values. Is there something that you'd like to add, maybe, Richard, about how cooperation, perhaps international cooperation, can help reach a more equal or equitable world?
Well, one personal anecdote, which I think is about gender equality. The first person I married, I've been married twice, was a tax professional. And in fact, we only decided to get married when the law in the UK was changed so that she ceased to exist for tax purposes as a consequence of marriage. In other words, she was allowed to submit her own tax return as a married person. Until then, we lived together. So tax inequality has had a real impact on my life, gender equality. Do we need to change? Look, there are a lot of things I'd like to change. I'm involved with a project at the moment, which is fascinating because I've been asked to think about tax in a new country. And how would I design a tax system for a new country? And the new country, by the way, is called Scotland. And Scotland might well be a new country in a few years' time. In my opinion, that's very highly likely. I do not see the UK surviving as a single country for very much longer. The pressure for splitting is incredibly high now. And it's fascinating to think about this because it makes you challenge all the assumptions inside the tax system you are most used to, the one of the UK. And there are a lot of things that are wrong, which we need to reform. And much of the time we talk about changing the individual taxes, but actually a lot of what has to change is around this issue of cooperation. And I would use a very specific example here. I've been heavily involved over many years in anti-tax haven campaigning. It's made me pretty unpopular in some tax haven places. I can assure you I get the death threats to prove it every now and again. Now, I've suggested that something which we've got quite used to in an international context, automatic information exchange from banks to tax authorities, should be extended to the UK domestic market. Now, of course, some of you listening will be asking, well, isn't it already? No, it isn't. In the UK now, if a UK resident person has an interest in a company in Georgetown, Cayman Islands, then a British bank with a branch in Georgetown, Cayman Islands, who's providing services to that person through a Cayman Island corporation will be notifying HM Revenue and Customs of that fact. If they do exactly the same activity in the UK with a UK resident company, then there is no automatic information exchange. Why do we have such a very large shadow economy in the UK, and why do we export so much tax abuse to the rest of Europe in particular? It's because we actually have an enormous corporate company production function inside the UK. There are 4.8 million companies in the UK now, vastly more than we can possibly justify. 2/3 of which say they never trade, even though there's no benefit, no obvious indication whether they do or don't, because we simply don't enforce company law in the UK. And fewer than 1/3 of which pay any tax at all, even though why do the others therefore exist is the best question to ask. And none of those questions are pursued. So one of the things that I'm looking at when I think about new tax systems is how actually you increase this degree of cooperation between banks, between tax professionals, between authorities to try to capture information on tax bases. We know as tax researchers, I mean, if I put on that hat at the moment, the works of people like Joel Slemrod show that if you have a source of tax income notified by a third party to a tax authority, then the taxpayer's chance of putting it on their tax return increases enormously. Well, we need to change the behavior of taxpayers in this sense to try to create this level playing field where fair markets might survive. This is a fundamentally pro-market activity. I find it deeply frustrating when I'm accused of being anti-market for suggesting that I want businesses to pay the taxes that they owe. No, that's pro-market. It's creating the level playing field, which is taught to undergraduate economists that this is what is required as the basis for fair competition. Well, we need to do that sort of thing. So I would love to make some changes to the tax system. For example, I believe that the day when we impose payroll taxes on employment, when employment is going to be the thing that we most want to create, is completely absurd. For example, over the coming years, I would like to create progressive consumption taxes. And I was delighted to hear earlier Philippe talking about the potential for taxes to be charged on cash flows. I believe that's quite essential. I think it's the basis, a genuine, strong basis for financial transaction taxes, not just on financial commodity trading, but literally on flows through individual bank accounts, which would mean that so many consumption tax charges, which are currently avoided by the wealthy because they save and don't consume, would become within the scope of an indirect tax, which could be subject to very rapid variation for the purpose as well of fiscal control to manage the economy in place of interest rate policy, which is now ineffective, these things would be enormously beneficial to the integration of tax thinking. But that does obviously require cooperation. But then I'm sitting in the UK at the moment, which is about to leave the European Union, with no idea what form of cooperation we're going to have left. And I'm ashamed to say that I don't know what we're going to be doing. And of course, I'm delighted that I have an Irish passport so that I remain European, despite the fact that I sound incredibly English and live in England. But, you know, I thankfully remain European too. We need that cooperation mentality. I entirely agree that this is key to our future.
Mm-hmm. And how does that cooperation mentality grow and spread? Because if that's what's needed, then how does that shift happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think this conference, of course, is a very good initiative. I have worked with many researchers around the world, and I really try to and of course you said networking. So I believe in something. That's why I'm here. So I'm not totally pessimistic, but there is what I sometimes as a law professor and being in universities for many decades now, I mean, I see young people that you have now lifted in your conference, 35, under 35, that's perfect, that's great. But I think it's a very, very small part of the law or economic professor or tax professionals in total, irrespective from which area they come from. But if I talk about law, I would say that we teach tax law very conservative around the globe, very, very conservative. And I mean, I really like to find cross-disciplinary positions. I don't think that the economists, the lawyers, the sociologists, the political science have the kind of one solution or the solution themselves. You can only really produce high quality proposals, solutions by the cross-disciplinary work, and also a cross-disciplinary work that really where the knowledge traverse over countries, over continents, where you you can have a more holistic or a more global perspective. You talked about tax reforms. Yeah, I've studied, and looked around the world and looked around where I could find some new reforms. Where is the initiative? Where can we see some collaboration around tax reforms? And I would love that people send me some examples, because I see very many reforms initiatives go down the drain, both on a more multinational level, like or bilateral level, like the European Union, but I also see it in my own country. I've seen it in the Nordic countries. I can see it. I've seen it in Australia. I've seen it in many places. So there is something. We wrote a very depressing article, me and a colleague, for a couple of years ago, where we said that there is the death of those. We see the death of the big new reforms, tax reforms. We can't see the new initiatives, but
they're there.
Course,
they're there.
You should never give up. I mean, there is a lot of things going on at the moment, and I think that the good ideas, maybe not the good ideas that are born in the departments, the Minister of Finances, or at those central organizations. Maybe there are. I see very many NGOs coming up with good ideas, but.
And those solutions might come.
At the moment, you have. I mean, we talk about the American election. We talk about Brazil. We talk about. I mean, we have a populistic political situation where I don't really see how good ideas can grow.
The solutions are coming from the ground up. They're coming from everywhere, but a lot of solutions, I believe, are coming from the ground up. I do trust that, you know, a younger generation can work with an older generation. You talk about cross-disciplinarity, and I think what we've learned also is that innovation comes also when multiple disciplines are exchanging and sharing ideas. So that's the world that I'm definitely excited about, and I think I'm going to pass it on to Richard, but I think you spoke of something that touches upon a point that Richard made earlier about, ethics being a part of the syllabus of education is something that he mentioned earlier when he spoke, and I think that those ideas are definitely connected. So maybe Richard, if you want to have a few more comments before we jump to our chat. We have some questions from the group and they want to participate.
Okay, look, I would just offer this idea that for far too long, and I'm agreeing very strongly here, we have lived with tax in a silo. You know, tax has simply got the job of raising money. No, it hasn't. That's the point I was making. Tax is a much bigger issue. In my book, The Joy of Tax, I happen to have a copy nearby, you know, but this is what I would, I explain that there are at least 6 reasons for tax. I would also promote another book for those who don't understand my arguments about the role of funding deficits. This is a really fantastic book. Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth. Well worth reading, not technically complicated, but fundamental rethinking of economics. But this issue is about breaking that silo that economics does not talk to tax, does not talk to accountancy, does not talk to law, does not talk to sustainability. I happen to be a professor in 3 disciplines, which is really bizarre. I think it's bizarre, but I ended up as a professor in 3 disciplines, including sustainability, because I co-wrote the Green New Deal, albeit in my case from a tax perspective, and the role of tax and accounting in delivering sustainable reform within our climate. Now, those cross-disciplines are critical. Unless we actually get to that point where we can understand that this is no longer an issue where tax sits in a tax conference, and economics in an economics conference, and so on, but we see how those work, not just in the disciplines that we're talking about, as a professor I would talk about, but actually on the ground, as I'm thinking, for example, about how a tax system would work in Scotland. You know, how does the local authority tax integrate with the national tax? How does the national tax authority integrate with the company law authority and onwards? Unless we can break tax out of this silo, we are in trouble. We have to think holistically because that's the world we live in.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, on those remarks, I believe we are going to cue to 2 questions that are coming from our group.
Je me demandais comment promouvoir une confiance entre les contribuables et l'État en matière de fiscalité. Merci. Bonne soirée.
How can we increase that trust in taxpayers and citizens and government? More transparency, perhaps, from part of government, I think is maybe the pathway that I would take here.
Well, I would undoubtedly agree with that. I'm actually doing some research at the moment on a very basic issue. What is the UK national debt? And do you know what? Nobody publishes what makes it up. We spend all our time in the UK obsessing about the size of our national debt and how it's going to constrain our behaviour and how taxpayers might have to fund it. And when you actually go and say, can you give me a breakdown of what makes up this number that you keep on talking about and publicising every month? Nobody tells us. There is no figure. And in fact, I'm in discussion with the Office for National Statistics in the UK, the Treasurer in the UK, and what we have, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which reviews their figures. And they're all absolutely deeply confused by my simple request, please give me information on the national debt and how it relates to taxation. So we've got to open up about what is happening. Now here I would agree with Nina. We clearly do need to improve the level of communication we have about how government relates to people in every country that I can see. Now, in the UK, the only organisations that communicate their tax affairs well are our local authorities. I get really good reports from local authorities about how they use their funding and how they literally are trying to align their goals with their tax policy. And I think that's amazing. But at national government, I don't get any of this. So we ask for good accounting from corporations, but government accounting is generally something which I call crap. Now, CRAP is actually an acronym. It stands for Completely Rubbish Approximations to the Truth. It might have other terms, but that's how I use it. I can use it in Parliament that way. And that's how bad government accounting is. We've got to actually be much more accountable as governments to get people to believe that government is a responsible custodian for funds.
Asa, is there something you'd like to add here?
Yeah, I would say, I will now slowly turn around to be a little bit more optimist and not so much a pessimist. No, I want to say that there is best practices in the world, for sure. And I must say that I'm quite proud of the Swedish tax authority. And I think that the transparency and legitimacy is so very important. But there is what you can't really export is that Sweden has had a long history, very long history in the trust of the state, irrespective if the state deserved it or not. But I mean, there has been kind of mentality that you of course can't, and the culture is historical roots that you can't export. But I mean, there is a best practice, and the Swedish tax authority has been a part of. I can't vouch for every international project that the Swedish tax authority has been involved in, but in many places they at least have exported this kind of openness and also control. I mean, that you know how many people you have in the country, you can, and you know what I mean. There's been very, and that you also have this very developed assessment or tax assessment. So as I worked once on a time, I worked in the tax authority, so maybe that's my but I think that is a good example on how a good tax authority can operate. But then of course you should be very, the way you spend the money is, and that you really spend it for the well-being of the member of the society. And that the society is very inclusive when it comes to who are the member of the society.
There's 2 points here. So first, the well-being of members of society, is that something that can be measured? I know that yesterday Mr. Bengio and Monsieur Auberson in the panel on AI spoke about this also. How can we measure these values, and values that are good for the common good? So perhaps this is a direction. Can there be a metric for that? And I am by far not a tax expert, but I love design, and if there is something that I learned from Scandinavian design, is that less is more. And we talk about cross-disciplinarity, and this idea of designing with less is more brings me, yesterday they were talking about simplifying the tax act for so that small businesses and medium-sized businesses can actually understand it, and simplifying and having this holistic approach. So perhaps to simplify and to communicate programs in a better way also to entrepreneurs that are trying to build and come up with innovative solutions during these times, I think, at least for me, I think would be a way that I see that, trust can be improved and be built. Trust is a difficult thing to build in these times. So thank you for that question. I think do we have time for another question? I think we received a few, so maybe if we can go to the other one.
Many people say that a key factor of tax avoidance and tax evasion is secrecy. So my question is, do you believe that exchange of information between countries could be a viable solution in ensuring everyone pays their taxes?
Yes. And also, I also would like the European Union to consider to take some measures when it comes to the countries inside Europe, that the European Union, that also part of this tax competition, and I don't understand why Luxembourg and are a member of the European Union, if I should be frank. So I mean, there has to be quite frank messages to countries around the world that are doing that have secrecy economy. That's my message.
And I agree. Look, I mean, transparency is fundamental, but we have to think what we mean about transparency. I get quite worried about the tax justice movement these days. In 2005, John Christensen and I wrote a document for the Tax Justice Network called Tax Us If You Can. And frankly, since then, quite a lot of the tax campaigning work around the world has been around the agenda that we laid out at that time. I'm not complaining, it's nice to see your ideas used, and one of those was automatic information exchange. And I can well remember in June 2009 being told in the UK Treasury that there was no chance that there would be any automatic information exchange from a tax haven in my lifetime. Well, I'm still alive. And automatic information exchange from tax havens is taking place. So therefore, one of us was right and one of us was wrong. And I was on the right side of that argument, and I spent a lot of time working on trying to see how we could establish that process. So I'm delighted that we are getting somewhere, but I'd also make a very critical point. And this is again about this idea of silos. What we are seeing is an awful lot of what I call constructive non-compliance. That means it looks like people are trying to comply. That's the constructive bit. The non-compliance is that they're making sure that the data is actually not moving as is required. So, for example, if it is required that data be exchanged on the beneficial ownership of a company, then we still have ample mechanisms available in many countries to prevent beneficial ownership being properly declared. So information exchange does not take place. This is easy to achieve in the UK, for example, where the law is frankly so lax it's ridiculous. And I'm sure it is in other countries as well. And we have plenty of other examples around this where income can be disguised as something which does not require exchange when there's a requirement that it should be. So we actually need to look at how we can create robust systems, remembering that the key thing here is actually that every tax system is at the end of the day voluntary. The rate of compliance that we can create is always dependent upon the taxpayer. You can never get 100% compliance. So our job is to maximize the rate of voluntary compliance amongst taxpayers, knowing that 100% will not happen. This is why making sure that not just that automatic information exchange takes place, but who it takes place for, and that taxpayers know that sufficient information is exchanged so that the smoking gun exists, so that they can be identified if they're not putting a source of income on their tax return, is vital to the success of the system. We don't need every single aspect of a taxpayer's affairs to be automatically information exchanged across international borders, so long as it's apparent that a person from one country has an interest in another country and it's likely that a tax consequence will arise and some indication of scale on that is available. Indication of scale is important. Is it the amount of interest paid? Is it the amount of money in the bank deposit account of the company in question? Whatever it might be, some indicator. That's sufficient for a risk appraisal to take place. We need risk assessment tools, and automatic information exchange is not just a system to enforce compliance, it's a system to encourage compliance, and they're not the same thing.
Okay. I think we're going to take one more question from the group.
Bonjour à tous. Je me demandais, est-ce que vous pensez que la justice fiscale elle soit réellement possible malgré qu'on vit dans un système qui est quand même très capitaliste?
Do you think that tax justice is really possible in a capitalist world?
I know so much French, I thought I heard.
Hang on, it's after midnight. You have asked me a question like that now? It's after 1 o'clock in Sweden.
Let's give it a try.
Which of us is going first?
No, I mean, capitalism, it's here to stay. You don't have any alternative. But I mean, of course, I would like to, let's say like this, with the pandemic, with the climate change, which also has to have an impact on the tax system, with the need of raising revenue to combat poverty in the world. That and if we do, and one can say that what I call the neoliberal capitalism that has been existing for a while now, I mean, it has been it has turned to have some elements of socialist economy, because there is so much what is in English called state aid that is channeled out in the world, and I mean, and if we also kind of earmark the state aid, and if you have to pay it back, or I mean, there's going to be a kind of mixed economy out of this pandemic situation for sure. And then you have to get some, if you want to do something with the climate or stop the catastrophe that we already are facing, then you need to plan the economy. You have to have a plan for the whole of the society, the whole economy. The whole economy has to move in one direction, and if you will improve gender equality, economic gender equality, I think also that needs instruments that are at least the old social democratic welfare model type of measures. That's my. You can't do this with a kind of a non-regulated capitalist economy for sure. No, I don't think so.
I'm going to hold up a book which is The Road from Mont Pelerin. Mont Pelerin was where Hayek formed the ideas that became neoliberalism. Neoliberalism corrupted the idea of capitalism. It is not, as I understand it, what capitalism should be. It is certainly not, even in a sense, what one of his close associates, Milton Friedman, did once famously say. He said it was the duty of a company to maximize profit and nothing else. But he did say, subject to the compliance with all regulation. Now, it's actually been so corrupted now that I have done research with colleagues at Sheffield University on what we call hollowed out corporations, where financial engineering is the major source of profit, and employee productivity, which is of course what should be the foundation of wealth in society, is not the main source of profit. So I would argue that one of the things, and John Christensen, with whom I co-founded in effect much of the work of the Tax Justice Network, would also agree with this. One of our jobs has been to save capitalism from itself, to point out that actually regulated capitalism, as we just talk about, that regulated capitalism is critical to understand how capitalism must work. No football match can be played without rules. No capitalist market system can work without rules. The idea that we have capitalism in tooth and claw, where winning everything is vital, is just simply untrue. Tax justice is trying to create a structure about transparency, accountability, fairness, and appropriate contribution that, as I say, really fundamentally is about actually saying, if we go back to the basics of what capitalism is supposed to be as it's taught in universities, it's about creating level playing fields where everybody competes fairly on the basis of the quality of the goods and services that they supply, and the consumer has to choose on that basis. The alternative, which is what neoliberalism has eventually created, and which threatens the very existence of capitalism itself in a way in which Karl Marx, I'm sure, would be delighted about, and I'm not a Marxist, but which does threaten it, is because it is undermined all those essential rules that are critical to the functioning of a mixed economy, which I believe is the foundation of our future. I do believe we need to have that right balance between state and private sector. I think that there is an equation to be made there, and it will change sometimes over periods of time. We're going to have more state at the moment, we might have less in the future, but there is a balance, and tax justice is an essential component of that, but so is the transparency that, again, we've been talking about. So you can't think of tax justice as in isolation or separated from. Again, don't see it as its own silo. It fits into the system and actually reinforces the fact that there is a relationship between taxpayer and state. In fact, that's what I see the tax in society as. If there is a social contract, and I believe there is a social contract between taxpayer and state, then tax is the consideration, to use a legal term, within that contract. It's what binds us together. And that's where tax justice has such an essential role, and ethics within it are so critical.